I'm endlessly fascinated and curious about the world around us, about business, about politics, about the arts, about culture, developments, social issues, and the people. Most importantly, about the people that are shaping our future. Every night, I get the opportunity to have conversations, to dive into conversations with thought leaders, with change makers, entrepreneurs, politicians, and everyday heroes who unpack the ideas and stories that I think matter to all of us. What's the future of our economy? What's the future of our country? How do we build stronger communities? What can we learn from music, theater, sports, politics, the arts? How does policy shape our real lives? What does leadership look like, real leadership in today's environment? If it's interesting and relevant and topical and we're talking about it, you'll hear about it here at 6 o'clock on the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I want to have real conversations, in-depth conversations. These are ideas we're sharing. This is the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Thanks for joining me. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got a really interesting guest for us tonight who's a writer. He's a historian, he's a teacher, he's a public speaker, and he's an author of a book called The Prime Ministers, Canada's Leaders and the Nation They Shaped. I became aware of him when he wrote an interesting article recently in the Toronto Star about what Mark Carney could learn from the prime ministers. J.D.M. Stewart is our guest today. He's a writer and historian, as I mentioned, and he's one of Canada's foremost experts on Canadian prime ministers. His commentaries regularly appear in the Globe and Mail, the Hub, the Literary Review of Canada, and as I mentioned, the Toronto Star. He often appears on television and radio programs where he can give us a historical perspective on the issues of the day, connecting them to his knowledge of prime ministers. James' previous book, Being Prime Minister, was on the Hill Times Top 100 pick. He's inspired also a generation of students during his 30-year career teaching history to high school students. In 2012, he was awarded a Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal for his contribution to history education in Canada. JDM, welcome to the show.
Brian, thanks for having me on the show.
My pleasure. So I read this article that I found really interesting, that Mark Carney could actually learn something from his predecessors. Do you think he's learned it? Did he listen to you?
I don't know.
Did he give you a call and say, tell me what I should learn?
He probably should give me a call. I'd love to have a meeting with the Prime Minister and talk about what he could learn from his predecessors. And of course, there's a lot that can be learned from previous Prime Ministers, just as in anyone's job, you could learn by the people who came before you. And I just pointed out a few different areas where he could learn from others. And I don't know how many examples you want to get into, but one of them I talked about was pragmatism. And being a pragmatic leader is pretty essential in a country like Canada because of the diverse elements of the country from east to west. And, we have a French-speaking population. We have many immigrants from around the world and different regions with different interests. So pragmatism is a very important attribute to have. And Mackenzie King is the prime minister that I cited in my article as an exemplar for him to follow in terms of being pragmatic.
I found that interesting because I understand that the Liberal Party in Ontario fragmented over this issue of conscription, and there was big debates back and forth. And you in the article quote King as saying not necessarily conscription, but conscription if necessary. And then you talk about him having, and I didn't know this, he actually had a referendum? Is that what happened?
Well, he had a plebiscite. So a plebiscite means that the government isn't bound by the results, whereas a referendum is a binding result. But this was one of the ways that Mackenzie King was a bit wily in his ways, because he had made a promise to Canadians that he would not invoke conscription. And the reason for that was of the divisions that it caused during the First World War. So he made that promise. But then it became apparent that conscription may well be necessary. And so his way out of it was to hold a plebiscite, not asking whether Canadians agreed with conscription or not, but whether they would agree to release the government from their promise not to bring in conscription. So it was a little bit of an incremental way of trying to get out of the predicament he had got himself in. Interestingly, the plebiscite did return strong numbers in favor of releasing the government from the promise, but it also returned strong numbers from Quebec not wanting the government to be released from the province. But at least it brought the issue forward and gave King somewhat of a mandate to bring in conscription later. But also, he knew he would have to mollify Quebec in some fashion. And I think he lost a couple of Quebec cabinet ministers over the issue. But it's another example of using a little bit of pulling the levers of government in order to sometimes buy time, kick something down the road, give a little bit of time for the air to come out of the issue. These are some strategies that Mackenzie King was very good at using.
Well, I've got a personal connection with the whole issue. My great uncle was Premier of Ontario at the time, and lost because of the issue on conscription. And he wanted to stay. He wanted to support Mackenzie King. Harry Nixon was his name,
Yeah.
and ended up losing because of fracture in his party, where his party wasn't supportive necessarily of Mackenzie King's plebiscite for and support for conscription, which is kind of an interesting connection. You then quote a poem,
Yes.
and I thought this poem was wonderful.
Mm.
Do you have it handy? Could you read it, or do you
Well,
want me to quote it?
I've just included a stanza. This is the F.R. Scott poem called WLMK. But if you want to read the stanza that you have there, then let's hear it.
He skillfully avoided what was wrong without saying what was right, and never let his on the one hand know what his on the other hand was doing. I
Right.
love
And
it.
it goes on also to say, never do by halves, which can be done by quarters. So this poem came out in 1957. F.R. Scott was a famous constitutional lawyer out of McGill, constitutional scholar, and he, the poem is a bit of a send up of Mackenzie King. But I first came across that poem when I was taking my intro to Canadian literature class at McGill University. And this poem was in the anthology. It's in a lot of anthologies for Canadian poetry. And it's a wonderful critique of Mackenzie King and speaks to this way of governing that it wasn't the most exciting thing. I think there's another line in there that the height of his ambition was to pile a royal commission on top of a parliamentary investigation or something like this. And it just got at that King's ability to obfuscate a little bit. There's another line in the poem about postpone, delay. And these were the things that King did in order to, he would say, sometimes being a successful prime minister is not the things that you do, it's the things that you don't do. So he was very calculating and strategic in the way that he ran the country.
Well, I'll give you my interesting anecdote that might be helpful. I met with former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney at one point in time, and he said that the benefit of his implementation of the free trade agreement was that, number one, it was commissioned by Pierre Trudeau. Trudeau Sr., that it was led by Ronald MacDonald, a former Liberal finance minister. It was 26 volumes of study. They traveled across the country with a royal commission. And then he had a election debate and an election that was really a referendum on free trade. So he said, even though the country was split and there were real issues on both sides, when I won that election after that process, led by a Liberal prime minister, a Liberal finance minister, 26 volumes, et cetera, it was a slam dunk. I could implement it because everyone felt it. He said, I did the opposite thing on the GST, which I'll live to regret, because smart people came up with the GST and I implemented it right away, and I went down to the most substantial defeat in electoral politics.
Yeah, it's sometimes timing and methods are everything, but the MacDonald Commission gave Mulroney a lot of cover on free trade. But, Mulroney's been vindicated on the GST by economists and, anyone who knows anything about taxation. When you take a tax that's hidden and inhibits manufacturing, and then you put it as a sales tax that everybody can see, maybe people don't like it, but it actually turned out to be very good for the Canadian economy and good for good tax policy.
Then he said, and this was after he was no longer elected. I met him at a wedding and I had a nice little chat with him off to the side of
Mm-hmm.
a wedding. And he said, the smartest economic thing and the stupidest political thing I did was the GST. The
Yeah.
smartest political thing and the stupidest economic thing that Stephen Harper did was take 2 points off of the GST.
Right. That's a good one, because whenever people think about the holes in the fiscal capacity of the federal government, everybody wishes that those 2 points were back there that Stephen Harper took off. And I wonder if there'll ever be a prime minister with the courage to say, we need to add one back, or we need to add two back, because that revenue has been essential to a lot of the things that the Canadian government does. And Harper did something that was so easy, and it'll take a lot of courage if anyone ever tries to bring back the 2 points that he took off.
Your second point was teamwork. And it's interesting because I think a lot of people remember Jean Chrétien and Paul Martin working well together. Some people think that Trudeau and Turner worked well together. I'm not sure whether that's the case or not. But we did have in the Trudeau era a lot of cabinet ministers that I think we can remember, and during the Mulroney era, Flaherty and other people, Wilson, that we can remember. Lately, we've seemed to have had PMOs, prime ministers, and even leaders. Pierre Poilievre. I don't know how many people could quote some of the other members of the front bench of the Conservative Party. So teamwork, is that something from a bygone era, or is that something that is still important today when Justin Trudeau seemed to have been a man unto himself. Harper seemed to be a man to himself. Carney seems to, as you quote in your article, seems to not have learned the lesson of teamwork. And certainly Pierre Poilievre seems to be a man of himself.
Yeah, I don't know if I will throw it into the dustbin of history just yet, because I think a lot of prime ministers have proven to be very successful by running a team. And let's face it, politics is teamwork, and you're only going to be as strong as your team is. But you do have to give them some power. And Jean Chrétien was my singular one of my examples there, because he was really, if we're going to call it old school principles, he learned government by being in the cabinets of Lester B. Pearson. So he saw the importance of the civil service, the importance of a cabinet that's allowed to do its power. And his cabinet really adored him. His caucus adored him. Teamwork is also about caucus. And I didn't get deep into caucus on that section, but prime ministers who look after their caucus, pay attention to them, they benefit from that. And they recruit loyal soldiers from that. And Chrétien was excellent at that. Brian Mulroney is probably the sine qua non of caucus managers, and phoning people when they had a caucus member who had a wife maybe that was in the hospital, and Mulroney's on the phone saying, "I hope everything's okay." He did those kinds of things all over the place. And now we know that Justin Trudeau, a lot of things are coming out about Justin Trudeau that cabinet ministers had trouble just getting meetings with him. That should never happen in cabinet government. And then so you can imagine what caucus members may have felt like, who could barely get time with the prime minister. So I think it's pretty clear that the most successful prime ministers will treat their teams as important parts of the success of the government. And those who ignore that, well, I guess some will have some success, but if you look at the Justin Trudeau and Stephen Harper examples, I don't know that there's people running out saying how great they were as team leaders.
So, one of my favorite books and concept is Team of Rivals, that talked about Lincoln and how he invited in the people that were against him. Many people say that one of Obama's most brilliant decisions was inviting Hillary Clinton in to be Secretary of State. We don't have a lot of examples of that in Canada of late. Lots of people have suggested that Pierre Poilievre was brilliant in really creating a party that was his, but excluded Jean Charest and some of the other people that were of the Red Tory ilk. Chrystia Freeland was the only rival that was included in cabinet, and now she's gone. So are Carney and Poilievre not listening to the history, or are they doing the right things?
Well, let's first give a shout out to Doris Kearns Goodwin, who wrote that book, Team of Rivals. Probably one of my favorite historians and a brilliant writer. I think that I would follow her. I mean, I would follow Lincoln's example. I would follow the examples of some of the great leaders in history, whether it's Laurier or Louis Saint Laurent or Abraham Lincoln. And remember, Brian Mulroney brought Joe Clark very close into the cabinet after that leadership race in 1983. So he knew how to keep some rivals in the cabinet because he just wanted the best people there with him. Carney, I haven't. Well, there weren't really a lot of rivals in the Poilievre or Carney situation because they both won their leaderships by such a dominating factor. There didn't seem to be a person at the head of a section of the party that he really needed to reach out to. So they haven't had quite the same opportunity just yet. But I think the other point here is bring great minds into your cabinet, even if you don't agree with them 100%. Bring the best mind in there and work it out.
We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in just 2 minutes with our guest who's written a fascinating book about prime ministers, J.D.M. Stewart. He's a writer, he's a teacher, he's a historian, and his book, The Prime Ministers, has been published this fall. And he's written a really interesting article about what Mark Carney could learn if he ever picked up the book and read it and or gave JDM a call. Stay with us, everyone. We'll be back in just 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got with us tonight J.D.M. Stewart. J.D.M. is a writer, he's a teacher, he's a historian, and he's an author of a book about prime ministers called The Prime Ministers. And he's written a really interesting article recently that was called These Are the Lessons Mark Carney Should Learn from Canada's Former Prime Ministers. And I thought that the inclusion of the word should is helpful. You didn't say could or might. You said he should. So obviously you're of this sense that he really should do something and learn from these prime ministers. And the first one that we talked about was pragmatism. The second one we talked about was teamwork. The third one is courage. Tell me, sir, why you think he's not courageous? Some people think it's all but about elbows up, and then other people have said, well, elbows down. What courage does he need?
Well, I think I'm not saying that he doesn't have courage or isn't going to have the opportunity to be courageous, but throughout his time in office, he's going to need to show courage in order to meet this challenging moment. There'll be tough decisions that have to be made. And I think, Mark Carney's only been prime minister for about 8 months. And so there's still a lot of time ahead of him and tougher decisions to be made. Some tough decisions, I guess you could say, were made in the budget, but I don't think the budget that was brought out has necessarily ruffled too many feathers. That the disbursement of jobs in the public service is going to be 40,000 people over 5 years. That gives it quite a bit of time. During the Paul Martin budget, that happened a lot quicker. And so my point here is just to remind the Prime Minister that courage is a necessity, and that as the people that I would cite there, whether it's McDonald and his railway and Brian Mulroney with his free trade or his tax policy, as you mentioned earlier, Brian, you do have to make tough decisions. And Mulroney used to say, I've not been governing for a good headline in 10 days. I govern for good policies for Canada in 10 years. And so Prime Minister Carney would be wise to take that advice from Brian Mulroney and remind Canadians of what he's doing. He should try to tell a story too, the courageous story. And he pokes around the edges on that, but I think that narrative still has to be developed about the courageous decisions that are being made as he tries to prepare Canada for what is really, as he likes to call it, a hinge moment in history, which I think it is.
I spoke with Jeff Rubin, a prominent Canadian economist, and he said that Mark Carney had a once-in-a-career lifetime opportunity to do a John A. Macdonald national program, and the railway was clearly what created Canada and what created John A. Macdonald and knit BC into a confederation, I think, and it was a huge investment, a huge vision for what Canada was about. And he said that pipelines could have and should have been the national program for Mark Carney, and that he said he squandered that opportunity because this budget and or right now is the time that he could have launched that. That he talks about us being an energy superpower, but the only energy superpowers in the world are ones that exploit their energy by way of a significant investment in infrastructure, and that to diversify our economy away from the United States, we've got to get our oil and our national and natural gas to Tidewater, both on the Pacific coast as well as the Atlantic coast. And you know everything else that he would have added to that. But he said if he had announced a national program comparable to the railway, building a pipeline to the east and west, people would have agreed with it. They would have agreed with the expense. They would have agreed with the vision, and that he didn't have the courage that he needed at this time of national emergency, given the Trump tariff threats. What do you say to that, sir?
He may have missed his moment. I think there's still a window there for him to be able to come back with something. But the pressures, like trying to get something like that lined up is a lot different than it was during the days of Sir John A. Macdonald. But this is why I think people are starting to say, well, where are the elbows up and where's this? We're going to do things faster than we ever thought we would before, because that sense, there is a bit of air coming out of that sense that he created during the election campaign. And so I think Canadians are still waiting to see that. So it's possible that he's missed his moments. They've been doing a few little things here with the creation of the Grand Projects location there in Calgary and so on. But it's not like he can come out, with McDonald's national policy. Everybody knew it was railways, immigration, and tariffs. Nobody knows exactly what this grand policy is that the Prime Minister wants to bring out right now. So I would advise him to get three big things and just say we're doing A, B, and C and start hammering on it, because there are a lot of challenges to try to diversify trade away from the United States. But I don't think he's put a narrative or something in the window for Canadians to say, that's what the big project is. It's a little too loosey-goosey right now.
Inspiration was your fourth lesson that he could learn. No, sorry, I apologize. Should learn from your book and from historical Canadian prime ministers. Tell me about inspiration.
Well, I think one of the roles of the Prime Minister of Canada is to inspire Canadians. And I'll say, Justin Trudeau fumbled the ball on that one. He was apologizing for Canadian history 7, 8, 9 times and would always say Canada was great with an asterisk, right? We're great, but. And so I cite the leader, Sir Wilfrid Laurier, who was one of our great inspirations as a former prime minister. He's the one who said that the 20th century will belong to Canada. He said, Canada has been the inspiration of my life. He said things like, let your motto be Canada first, Canada last, Canada always. And so he had a love of country, and he used his words to spread that inspiration across the country. And inspiration is an important part of being prime minister. And, Mark Carney and others need to use the power of speech to inspire and paint a picture of what they think this country can be and how great they think it can be. Because Canadians want to feel that from their leaders, and they want to be a part of that. So the Prime Minister needs to show some inspiration for everybody, and especially coming out of a period where, quite frankly, I don't think the previous Prime Minister did a very good job of that. And so there's a real opportunity for Mark Carney here.
Well, he's talked about how, the geopolitical situation has changed, that our relationship with the United States will be forever changed. So he's set the tone, the opportunity for that kind of a speech, that kind of a courageous infrastructure plan. Why don't you think he's grabbed that opportunity?
Well, it could be that he's too busy trying to get other things in gear and hasn't given much attention to speech writing and rhetorical flourishes. Because remember, a prime minister doesn't usually write his own speeches. He might say, this is what I want to do. But you have to have some good speechwriters in your office in order to bring the rhetorical flourishes forward. So, he's a banker. They didn't exactly make their living inspiring a room full of people. So it's not necessarily germane to the Mark Carney DNA. That said, Mark Carney has a pretty good sense of humor, which I don't know how many people have picked up on it, but he's a pretty funny guy. He's amused by the whole thing about being prime minister. And I think he can do it. But it's just a matter of setting priorities. So if he wants to inspire, he's got to get the right people in front of him. For example, that speech that he gave in front of the young kids 2 weeks ago, this nationally televised important budget speech, which turned out to be a bit of a dud, if you asked me. It just was like, It was like one of his campaign speeches, just changed up for a new audience, and it didn't sing off the page. And not every prime minister can do it, but it is at least worth trying to bring some flourish to your public remarks.
You quote in your article a Laurier speech to Parliament when he was arguing in 1903 for a second transcontinental railway. Do you have it, or can I read it?
Yeah, you go ahead and read it. This is the one about tomorrow and tomorrow. I think he's making a Shakespeare allusion here.
We are just on the fringe of our obligations if we want to be true to our destiny. We must commence here and now, not tomorrow, nor the day after tomorrow, but at this moment if the Canadian people want to be true to the destinies of the Canadian nation.
Yeah, see, it's so great, right? I mean, it's just it gives you a little bit of a chill to think about someone putting together some words so eloquently about trying to grab your destiny. And, there's all kinds of opportunities because the prime minister has spoken about this as a hinge moment. And he can say to Canadians, what kind of a country are we going to be at this hinge moment? And one of the definitions of a nation, and F.H. Underhill, a former U of T history professor, said this is it's a group of people who have done great things together in the past and intend to do more great things together in the future. Well, that's a pretty good definition, and it's certainly one the prime minister could build upon in one of his speeches, because we have all kinds of achievements, and we just need to be inspired a bit more about what we can do together. Because a country, there's a lot to be said for someone who will put some poetry in front of people. Look what Barack Obama did in the United States when he ran for president in 2008. He got people fired up. And now maybe Mark Carney can't be Barack Obama. Obama's kind of a singular type of personality, but you can rise to the occasion and do things that inspire.
What was his line? Fired up?
Was that Obama's line?
Yeah. He had
Yeah.
everyone cheer something after that. What was it?
Yeah, I don't remember. I don't remember.
And the audacity of hope. Um,
Right.
but he also had an incredibly interesting personal story, and this improbable rise. Um, you know, Mark Carney hasn't been in politics. He's been, as you said, a banker, and he's been a banker around the world. It's maybe not as improbable as a gentleman with a middle name Muhammad, but it's still or Hussein. It's
Hussein,
a
yeah.
it's a fascinating rise.
Yeah, I mean, but with I mean, the comparison between the two probably isn't great, but it's not as though Mark
Ready to
Carney was
go. That was
born
it. Fired up, ready to
fired up,
go.
ready to go. It's not like Carney was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, right? He's born in the Northwest Territories, grew up at Edmonton, and ended up getting a scholarship to Harvard. So clearly, he was a talent as a young man, but he wasn't brought up in a gilded home or anything like that. But one interesting point your readers or listeners probably don't know about Mark Carney is that he is the only Canadian prime minister to have not had secondary post-secondary education in Canada of those who came, say, after the Second World War, those who had a legitimate chance going to university here. So he's the only one. No university education in Canada. It was always elsewhere.
Is that good or bad?
I don't think it's neither good or bad. It's more of a footnote of trivia. I don't think anyone's going to take away anyone's opportunity if they happen to get a scholarship to Harvard, and then they're like, oh, you can come to Cambridge University or Oxford. I think it was Oxford. I don't begrudge him that at all. So he lived his life here and then came back to work here for part of his working life. So it's just an interesting footnote.
So your four lessons from history that Mark Carney should learn are pragmatism, teamwork, courage, and inspiration.
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in 2 minutes with our guest, JDM. And we're going to ask JDM Stewart maybe to read something from his book for us so we get a sense of what the book about the prime ministers is all about, and maybe what we could learn, if not Mark Carney is going to, from his book and from the lessons of history from our prime ministers. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Really enjoying my conversation with J.D.M. Stewart tonight, who's the author of a book called The Prime Ministers that's being released this month, but also an author of another book on prime ministers. He's an author of an article that I read in the Toronto Star that was really interesting about what Mark Carney should learn from our historical prime ministers. But you've been a teacher most of your
Hmm.
life. I want to ask you
Yeah.
about that because it's interesting. You've got a BA from McGill in history and a BA in physical education. That's an interesting combination. And then you went on
Yeah.
to quite a interesting career in teaching. You were a history teacher in Montreal, in Westmount,
Yeah.
but then in Panama for two
Yes.
years, and then in Toronto at the Sterling Hall and Bishop Strachan School for over 25 years
Yeah.
combined teaching of history. Tell me, what's it like being a history teacher? How do you motivate your students to be interested in history? And did they learn from history? Should they learn from history? If you had to apply the same concept that you apply to Mark Carney, that he should learn from history, should all of us learn from history? Can all of us learn from history?
Well, yeah, we all can learn from history for sure. And my approach with students was, teaching is it's a lot of things, but it's part art, it's part science, and it's very much about human relationships. Much like history is a lot about human relationships. So my goal was always to try to tell the most interesting stories to capture students' attention, because you do have to try to capture their attention. And also, there's a lot of thinking skills that go into history. But I think what would happen is, I've got quite a bit of passion for history, and I've got passion for Canada. And then students pick up on those cues that come from a teacher. So if they see the teacher taking their subject seriously and seeing where it's interesting and getting excited about it, it can be kind of contagious. And so I used to always ask my students when they would first come into my history class in grade 10, and I would get them to be as honest as possible and say, how many of you really don't like history? And a lot of hands would go up. I said, okay, that's no problem. I've got no problem with this. I said, all I'm going to ask you to do is keep an open mind. And if there's a period that comes during this year where you think you're moving from the category of I don't really like history to I kind of like history, then just let me know. And I could move most of those students, not all of them, I could move them into the category, well, history is actually kind of interesting. The history kind of sells itself too, Brian. We're talking about in grade 10, you're teaching the First World War, you're teaching the Second World War. Students are highly interested in those stories, particularly as they relate to the soldiers and the experiences that they faced. Anything that deals with emotional aspects can really get students hooked. And let's face it, there's very few things more emotional than the experience of soldiers and people at home during the war. So I think a lot can be learned from history. And I think what happened is I would tell students too that learning history is an invitation to an adult conversation, because maybe you've heard about some of these things when you've heard your parents talking or you heard about something on the news. But once you equip yourself with a little bit of cultural capital and historical knowledge, you'll be able to participate in those conversations too. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone walks out of my door as a history aficionado, but at least my goal was for them to leave grade 10 Canadian history feeling that A, history is interesting, and B, I learned something and it wasn't boring like everybody told it would be. And so to me, that's a win. And I always enjoyed my years teaching history because kids actually liked it. And it's such a great subject to deal with.
You used a term that I've never heard before. JDM, I've heard of political capital, I've heard of human capital, I've heard of financial capital, I've heard of natural resource capital. I've never heard of cultural capital before. What's cultural capital?
Cultural capital is the understanding that you have of the place where you live, the culture of Canada, the things that bind us. And in my book, I quote the Massey Commission, which was a 1951 report on Canada's cultural future. because the country was worried about the encroachment of the United States and what was going to be of a Canadian culture. In 1951, when they issued their report, the report said, "It is desirable that the Canadian people should know as much as possible about their country, its history and traditions, and about their national life and common achievements." I don't think there's been a better phrase that captures the things that we need to know about if we're going to be united as Canadians. And that came from 1951, and it's as true today as it was then. And so this is about developing a common currency so you understand the history of your country from one side of the country to the other.
I chatted with someone who was one of the final potential contestants in the last Conservative leadership. And this individual said that the biggest problem we had in Canada is that we didn't have one national culture, that we didn't have a philosophy or an image or a sense of identity of what it was to be Canadian. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think that's imperiled a little bit right now. I wouldn't say that it's never been. I think we do have some of the structures in place for those types of things. But as we've lost, we used to have a lot of national institutions around which we could develop that common understanding, whether it was, certain sports tournaments, institutions like CBC Radio or others, people reading similar newspapers and getting a sense of a common narrative. That's broken down. Certain leaders have not told the story of Canada very well. I'd say Justin Trudeau is guilty of that. But when you have a fragmented social media landscape, it does make it harder to make a coherent identity travel. And but I wouldn't give up on it, because I think there's still, by and large, Canadians feel connected to the country. We need to work on that. And I think things that the government should do is make sure at some point in a student's high school career, or sometime before they turn, say, age 20, they should have the opportunity to go and visit another province and do something meaningful, whether it's a semester at school or a 3-week exchange or something, because traveling the country and seeing other spots is what really helps you develop an understanding of the country. And if you don't see other places, then it's pretty hard to have a connection.
I have to agree with that. I've been uniquely, I think, almost benefited in my career where I travel across the country quite a bit. And I travel, I've never actually been to the north, but I've been as far north as Fort McMurray, which was fascinating to travel through and see and interview business people and people involved in economic development and politics in Fort McMurray. I've traveled to every major city across Canada, other than a few in Atlantic Canada, doing business. And while they're interacting with people from a political standpoint, from a economic standpoint, from a banking standpoint, etc. One of the things I really want to do is the rail trip across Canada, and that's
Yeah.
one of my bucket list things to do. How did you get to know Canada?
Well, I'll tell you one thing. I did do that rail trip in March. I took the train from Toronto to Vancouver, which was a wonderful experience. But one of my most formative experiences as a young person was I participated in a program called the Forum for Young Canadians, and it still exists. It's run by the Rideau Hall Foundation now. And that brought Canadians from every province and territory to Ottawa for a week of learning about Canadian government. But all the learning was really happening when you were talking to your 16-year-old friends from Prince Edward Island, or someone from Manitoba or British Columbia, whatever the case may be. I left there and I just had such a sense of Canada and had made these friendships from literally across the country, including French-speaking Quebecers that I could practice my French with. And then, I also was fortunate enough to go to university in Montreal, which also opened up my eyes. And I went there purposefully for that purpose, to try to understand Quebec better. I spent 6 weeks living in Jonquière, Quebec, to learn French, and learned more about Quebec culture than I did the language, because my language skills were already pretty good. But those kinds of experiences where you meet other people from the country, or you go live in another part of the country, it really helps a person to understand the country. And I would encourage the government to see about what programs that either are already existing that they could improve, or what they might be able to start up, things that could be geared towards young people to get that kind of understanding about the country. And I think when Mackenzie King first traveled in an airplane and he saw the country from on high, he's like, oh my God, if only more Canadians could see what I'm seeing right now. Because you really do get an appreciation for this country. The first time you go west and see the Rocky Mountains, you're like, oh my God. And you just feel so proud of being a part of this great geographical landscape.
Do you have the book handy? Could you read something from the book? I think it'd be really helpful to get a sense of your writing and of the stories and of what your intention is. If you could possibly read a page from your book.
Sure. I think what I decided I would read, Brian, is two short bits from my introduction where I talk about why I'm writing this book. So this is from the introduction of the Prime Ministers. A small anecdote illustrates why Canada needs a new book on the history of its prime ministers. 2 years ago, I spoke to an assembly of Canadian high school students at a model United Nations event. On the large screen for my presentation was a photograph of Lester B. Pearson with his name underneath. I asked the students who he was. No one knew. I expressed my surprise to the teacher afterward, and she told me, no one really teaches about prime ministers anymore. This is only an anecdote, but it speaks volumes about the teaching of Canadian history in our schools. The topic of prime ministers should definitely be included in the history curriculum. Peter C. Newman once wrote that every hour a prime minister spends in that office is an hour in his country's history. He's not a functionary, but a man chosen by the people to embody the national direction. If we want to understand this country, it is imperative that we understand those who led it. So then I move on a little bit later into the introduction, and I conclude it by saying, this brings me to some burning questions of our times. How do we reconcile the past with the present? Must our former prime ministers have been saints by present-day standards? How do we measure their successes and failures? What lens do we use? If it is a single lens, based exclusively on today's values and ignoring those of the past, then that is a mistake. Those who lived several decades or even centuries ago cannot possibly be expected to have viewed the world the way we do today. Just as those of us living today should not be held to the standard of a future world about which we have no familiarity when a judgment is eventually rendered on our actions. These are difficult questions, but must be explored as we continue to tell the stories of the past. Even worse would be to pay no attention at all. School curricula are changing, and in many instances, the relevance of the past is being diminished. Now is the time for a fresh perspective on this critical issue. In their 1999 book, Jack Granatstein and Norm Hilmer wrote, "Today's scoundrel can be tomorrow's hero depending on how events and perceptions alter interpretations." Whether scoundrel or hero, or both, Canada's prime ministers have altered our history. To know them is to know ourselves.
So I've heard stories that MacDonald was a drunk and Mackenzie King participated in seances. Are those some of the stories that you've got in your book?
Yeah, those are they're both in the book. And I think it's important to see our leaders not as single-dimensional politicians who just make decisions, but they're humans too, with interests and motivations. And yeah, MacDonald had a drinking problem, and I think for too long, we've kind of seen that as the joke on MacDonald. But if you look at the life he had, where he lost a wife, he lost a child, there might have been some trauma that the poor man suffered because of death in his family. And maybe now we're getting a bit more of a modern understanding of people with alcohol problems. And, MacDonald joked about it, I guess, and we didn't take alcoholism seriously then. But he had a tragic life, and I'm sure he was compensating for something. And as for Mackenzie King, spiritualism, there was a subset of people, particularly in Europe, for whom spiritualism was a normal and natural part of their life. And for King, that was the case. And he kept it very private, because we all have private lives too. So the prime ministers are no different.
You closed your article with a fascinating quote from Lester B. Pearson. You actually describe it with a word I don't even know. I can't even pronounce it. Apocryphal? What is
Yeah,
that word?
apocryphal, which means maybe he said it, maybe people just said he said it, but we think it comes from him, but it's not 100% verified.
Can I read it?
Yes, please do. It's a fantastic quotation about being prime minister.
Prime ministers require the hide of a rhinoceros, the morals of St. Francis, the patience of Job, the wisdom of Solomon, the strength of Hercules, the leadership of Napoleon, the magnetism of a beetle, and the subtlety of Machiavelli. What do you
Yeah.
think of that? Tell me what you think you hear from that.
Well, what I hear from that is Pearson saying it's kind of an impossible job to do, which it kind of is, and that there's you've got so much coming at you, intrigue, unforeseen problems, the media gaming for you, and that you really do need a thick skin, and you need a lot of patience. You also need, I don't know if, yeah, when he says the strength of Hercules, I think there he's talking about the ability to work hard, because what a lot of people don't realize about the job of prime minister is that it is an all-consuming job that takes a tremendous amount of time, a tremendous amount of mental focus, and even the travel is pretty demanding on the body, as anyone who's traveled around a lot knows. And I know the prime minister doesn't have to deal with a lot of stuff when he's traveling in terms of going through customs and waiting in airports and things like that. But nonetheless, the time change and travel, it's never easy on the body. So Pearson's just saying here that this is a really hard job, and just be prepared for just about anything. And I think all prime ministers would agree with that. Now, despite all that, I think it was Pierre Trudeau who said something like, "It's better than working at another job. Like the job is really hard, but it's better than any other job." So I think I'll be quite happy to continue to be prime minister.
So if Mark Carney called you up and asked you for a coffee or a meeting and said, "Look, I hear all of what you got to say. I've read your book. I've listened to the interviews you've done, etc. But what are the three things that you think I should do to be courageous, to show inspiration? What are those three things that I should announce in the next week?" What would you tell him?
Well, I'd need a little bit more insight in intel from his government about what he's thinking of doing. But I might say, well, Prime Minister, I'm going to be in Ottawa next week. So if you want to have a sit down, let's do it. Um, I think I would say decide what the story is going to be. What's the vision here? Hang some projects on that. Be upfront about what we're going to do, because I think people are waiting for, they don't want to drib drab and go, yeah, there might be a port, there might not be a port. We're hoping for a pipeline, but we got to see. I think we need to be a bit more definitive about some of these things, because some of them are really hard to do because of the way the country's put together now in terms of environmental assessments, Indigenous peoples' approvals. But I would say be a bit more concrete and firm about what it is you're trying to do, because it just seems like there's a lot of irons in the fire right now, and we don't really know which ones are going to catch. And so I would say to be a bit bolder on what that is, and keep repeating it, and do so with flourish, like you mean it.
JDM Stewart, thanks so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. Remind us all the title of your book, please.
It is The Prime Ministers, Canada's Leaders and the Nation They Shaped. It's available online at your favorite bookstore, in person, wherever you buy your books.
I think Mark Carney should give you a call and hear what you got to say. I agree with you. I think that being bold is the right strategy. And I think that we have talked about a lot of different things. I think he's got to be definitive and state these are the things that we must do to create the Canada that we all dream of, and that we've dreamed of for 100 and plus years. And I think that if he did that, and if he said that, I think the country would be behind him right now. And he's got almost a once in a lifetime, once in a country lifetime kind of opportunity, probably never repeated since maybe Trudeau with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, or Mulroney with free trade, or Kretsch and Martin with changing our financial situation, and that's equal to those opportunities to recreate what Canada is and should be. And I do think that a national program like a pipeline from east to west, like the railway that MacDonald supported, that brought our country together initially back in 1867, would be the kind of project that could bring us all together. JDM, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Brian. Great conversation.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining. I remind you, I'm on every night at 6 o'clock on 960 AM in Toronto, but you can get me from across Canada at www.saga960am.ca. All my podcasts and videos go up on my website, briancrombie.com, on social media, on my YouTube channel, on podcast servers, as soon as the radio show gets broadcast to air. Thanks for joining us, everybody. This has been wonderful, JDM. Invite me to your book launch, please. I want to be there and congratulate you. Good night,
That will
everybody.
do.